Veiled Voices follows 3 Muslim women religious leaders in Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt from about late 2006 to 2008. I did primary shooting in early 2007 and then we returned both to Syria and Egypt for follow-ups. And what I was really interested in investigating is what is the role of women in leadership within mainstream Islam? What kind of power do they wield? What obstacles do they have? Do they practice what they preach? And so, you know, the answers that I found ended up in the structure of the documentary.
Yeah, I find that interesting about the film because it does seem to be an inquiry in the same way that I feel like reading Fatima Mernissi or academics writing about Islam, feminist Islamic scholars writing about women in Islam. It feels like it has that same investigative spirit. And what kind of intrigued me about the film was, you know, what is this doing differently? That's what I kept asking myself. I recently made a film about Iranian revolution, the Iranian Revolution, and my parents' divorce and the aftermath of that revolution. And the film was a personal essay. In order to make it accessible to an audience, there's a certain amount of context that has to come in. But then you also want the audience to do the work. And I feel like a film about the Middle East, at this point, the best it can hope to do is to raise a question, because so much of what people see is closed media, you know, that gives them an answer. Women are oppressed in the Middle East. That's your answer. Societies are primitive in the Middle East. Men with beards are terrorists in the Middle East. So these are your answers, and it's a closed story, and there's not really interrogation of that. There's only reinforcement of those stereotypes.
That there was a rich secularism in Iran before the revolution. People just assume, you know, that it was you know, always had a history of what they refer to as fundamentalism. I think hearing those kind of stories are so important. In the same way that it was when people ask with Veiled Voices, well, why don't you feature any why don't you feature more secular women in the documentary? And I said, well, that would make a really great documentary, and I think that needs to be done. I think that there needs to be more films that follow contemporary political secular women, or women who are religious but choose not to adhere to mainstream norms such as wearing hijab, which is, you know, something that is you know, something that's been very politicized both in Iran and, you know, basically it's been politicized throughout the Middle East, and so we need to hear from those voices as well. But I am, since making Veiled Voices, much more interested in also telling stories of women who are either, you know, practicing Muslims who do not adhere to mainstream norms such as wearing a hijab, but are still very much Muslims, because the idea of covering or not covering that isn't what's the analogy I'm looking for? It's not a slam dunk. People assume it's a slam dunk, and it's not at all. It's just because you're a Muslim woman, there should not be an assumption there that you have to wear a hijab, and I think that misunderstanding is pervasive in the United States, but it's also equally problematic in the Middle East. What's critical is like, well, how is the American audience, which is extremely diverse as well, what's going to be their endpoint? What's going to be their hook? And I think that with your work, starting from an autobiographical standpoint of, you know, I am an American Iranian. I have these questions about both my identity, my cultural history, my parents. These are the same questions that people have about their identity in the Middle East are not dissimilar to the questions that we have. One of the things that, at least in the Q&As, and then in talking with people who have seen Veiled Voices, is that they reflect on the fact that their issues aren't dissimilar to these women's issues, and I think that at least that's a starting point. You know, maybe they've been, as you mentioned, they've been through a divorce. They can identify with that. They have had, you know, they've been in an abusive relationship, and, you know, let's say they are religiously minded. well, they don't think that the abuse is attributed to their religion, you know, within the Abrahamic faith, let's say, Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, they're not going to blame it on Judaism or Christianity, so why would you blame it on Islam? And so that there's these kind of endpoints that they can begin to kind of work through some of the stereotypes that they have. Lebanon has made great strides in terms of sectarian division, but having lived there, there's still a long ways to go, and you sometimes feel, you sometimes question really how much have they learned from, you know, the devastating civil war, because you see the youth who, you know, didn't grow, who were just little kids when the civil war was ending, almost repeating mistakes that their parents made. And, you know, it's odd for me to say, as an outsider, make that observation, so I could be, you know, misinterpreting or looking at it from too shallow of a perspective. But having taught students there, you know, between 18 and 22, I would think, my God, my goodness, you know, don't you understand how devastating this war was? And I'm hearing these crazy things coming out of your mouth in terms of prejudices, and it was extremely frustrating at times. Some were amazingly open and they got it, but some were still quite sectarian. The difficulty of talking about abusive relationships in general, I mean, it doesn't matter. It transcends culture, it transcends religion. The fact of the matter is that when you're in an abusive relationship, you try so hard to hide it, that when you're finally outside of it, you are free to talk about it.
Well, Brigid, thank you so much for sitting down with me and
talking.
Thank
you so much.
It's really great to meet a filmmaker who's working in the same kind of, with the same questions, because they're complex questions, and there should be more of us.
Inshallah.
Inshallah, that's right.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Talking to you as well.